Today we're looking at the story of Exodus 17, verses 1 through 7. Ever been caught between a rock and a hard place, in a no-win situation? Often it's not the situation, but how you react to the problem that's what counts. Today we're going to look at Exodus chapter 17 and Israel at Rephidim. We're going to take an exegetical field trip as well, which should really be a lot of fun. But first, we need coffee. Good morning, my name is David Paris, and in this video we're looking at Israel's experience during the wilderness when they're at Rephidim in Exodus chapter 17. Now also be sure to stick around to the end of this video because I want to fill you in on some of the plans and changes I'm going to be making. But enough of that, let's jump into our content. Now this passage is read during the third Sunday of Lent to help prepare our hearts for that season. And it really uses the lesson that Israel learned in the wilderness as a way to encourage us as we're going through very, very tough times as well. In order to understand the story, we need a little bit of context and background. Israel has begun its wanderings from Egypt to the Promised Land. They're going to spend 40 years in the wilderness. Now we're not sure how long it took them to get down to Rephidim, and we don't exactly know the location of many of the geographical references that have been made so far in the wanderings, but we can paint a general idea of their journey so far. So let's take a look at the map and see where they've been. After crossing the Red Sea, Moses has led the people south along the western peninsula of Sinai. During this trek, the people have been tested several times by crisis situations along the route. At Marah, God provided them with sweet water to drink. When they reached Elim, there were 12 springs of water with palm trees. And when the people reached the wilderness of Sin, an ominous name for a location, they lacked meat, and God provided the quail in Exodus chapter 16, verse 4. Now what we see here is a repeated pattern in Exodus. God leads the people to some location only for the people of Israel to find out that they're lacking some form of provision there. In most of these stories, Moses acts as an intermediary between the people and God. While God provided for his people, he was also testing them while they were in the wilderness. And all these themes are present in this Sunday's reading as well. Exodus 17:1 opens the story. And it says that all the congregation of Israel moved on from the wilderness of Sin by stages, according to the commandment of the Lord. And they camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So we see right at the very start a couple things that help us understand this story. First off, the people arrived at Rephidim as the Lord commanded. Rephidim is the last encampment that Israel is going to have before they reach Mount Sinai. And the crisis in this story is evident immediately. There was no water to drink. Now, unlike Marah, where there was water to drink but was bitter, at Rephidim there is no water. And you can see from a couple images that I have here just how barren and desolate it was. Now, the reason why it lacks water is probably because there wasn't an oasis within walking distance of the camp. Now, this sets up the central theme of this story. Are they going to trust in God's provision and presence with them in the wilderness during this very difficult time? In verse 2, we're told that the people quarreled with Moses and they say, "Give us water to drink." And Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" Their complaints against Moses reveals a fundamental issue. They don't perceive God as the one leading them, but instead take their complaints to the person that they can see, touch, and feel, Moses. Moses, however, is only responsible to be faithful with what God has commanded him to do. Their challenging Moses' leadership betrays a more fundamental issue, their failure to trust in God's provision. Now there's two verbs that Moses uses in this reply. The first is, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" quarrel, and test. So let's look at this first verb, quarrel. Oftentimes it's translated as contend. The verb for quarrel comes from the Hebrew riv, which is going to later be used as the name that Israel will use for that location, or meribah, which means quarreling. The second verb, test, the people were testing God. The verb for test is nasa, which is going to be picked up later and used to form the name Massah, which is what they're going to call the place. In verse 3, the people ask, "But the people thirsted for water, and the people grumbled against Moses and said, 'Why did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?'" This idea of kill is pretty desperate. Despite Moses rebuking the people for testing the Lord, their complaints only get intensified. The reaction of the people of Israel is understandable. Moses was their people. But now they've arrived at a location without water. They lack one of the very basic elements that is necessary for human life. What we take as part of daily life is suddenly absent. And this absence raises its prominence in our lives. Where is it? What am I going to do? Am I going to die? But the key point here is, what does the author tell us? They can't tell us everything about the story. We don't know what Moses wore or what the temperature that day was or the weather. The key point is, what are the details they tell us? That's what's significant here. And the significant point in this story is that the people were in fear and desperation, and they were reacting poorly to the situation. They thought that they were going to die, and they thought Moses was responsible for this. Now in verse 4, Moses cries out to God, "What shall I do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me." Now you see, Moses here also is in desperation. He's fearing for his life as well. So you've got the people afraid they're going to die from dehydration and lack of water, and you've got Moses fearing for his life before the people. Moses cried to the Lord. This is one of the dominant traits that gets painted of Moses during Israel's 40 years in the wilderness. When faced with a challenging situation, Moses takes it to God in prayer. You can see this in 15:25, 24:15, 32:30, and Numbers 11, chapter 11, chapter 12, verse 11, chapter 14 forward. This pattern indicates two important things. First, Moses was a human being like everyone else. He has no special qualities or abilities. Everything he accomplished was done by following God's directions and relying on God to accomplish those goals. Second, the measure of Moses' leadership and his accomplishments is not based on numbers. Rather, if we look at Moses' accomplishment that way, only two people, Joshua and Caleb, make it into the promised land. Moses doesn't even make it. So if we were looking at numbers, we would have to say Moses is a miserable failure, perhaps one of the worst in history. Instead, we need to measure Moses' leadership based on his faithfulness and trust in God. Let's take a look at verse 5 now. Verse 5 reads, "And the Lord said to Moses, 'Pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on a rock at Horeb, and you will strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people shall drink.'" Now at the very beginning of this story, verse 17:1, we're told that the people were commanded by God to go to Rephidim. Now we get God's second commandment. Moses is to go before the people with the staff that he struck the Nile with. Now this creates an interesting intertextual connection. When Moses struck the Nile, it resulted in a plague on Egypt. The water was defiled. The reference to this specific staff sets the reader up to think that some form of judgment or something bad is going to come. When he struck the Nile, Egypt's water supply was undrinkable. Now the opposite is going to happen. God is going to provide water where there is none. In verse 6, it starts off with this rock at Rephidim. Now it's interesting because the text doesn't indicate the distance between these two locations, between Rephidim and Horeb. They may be near each other, but probably within a walking distance. The other thing is this reference to the rock at Rephidim indicates that it's a fairly prominent geographical location, something that the people there would know. Because you can see this specifically when God says, I will be standing on the rock at Rephidim. We're not talking about a pile of rocks or something like that. We're talking about a prominent geographical location. Now, in order to understand this, we need to do some exegetical work. And as I always tell my students, you need to use the right tool for the right job. And in this case, it's going to require a field trip. So let's go. Now, if we're going to take a field trip, we need the right tool for the right job. So let's see. No too thin. No two person. Gravel. Okay, quite possibly. This is what we need. So, okay, I think I found a great spot to go looking for rocks. You want to help me look for rocks? Huh? You want to help me look for rocks? Yeah. Doing exegetical rock work, and I've recruited my good friend Dave. And for this dramatization, I'm going to be Moses, and he's going to be the people of Israel. Found our first rock. When we talk about the rock at Horeb, you think that one exegetically fits the passage?
I think it's a little bit on the small side.
Okay, all right, so that was my consensus too. Rock 1 does not fit the criteria exegetically, so we will move on and seek out more rocks. Hey, that looks like a good rock. Should we check it out?
Let's check it out. You think that this rock has the complete package of delivering this water?
I'm not sure we supply enough water for thousands upon thousands of people. Do you concur, Dr. Myers?
I concur. The volume of this rock compared to the volume of the water needed, it would make it highly improbable that that should be a sufficient amount.
Okay, now we're getting into more promising territory. You can see the big rocks down there. We're going to go down and see how they do exegetically. This downhill run is being videotaped just for my good friend Kurt Emery, who hasn't gotten to ride this trail yet. I think this rock will do. What do you think, Dr. Myers? Will this rock do?
This rock is definitely sufficient.
I think exegetically this rock matches the rock at Horeb. Okay, Moses, do your job.
I think I hear something.
Hold on a second. As one of the Israelites, I have to remove my Oakleys. But as everyone knows, they didn't have Oakleys back then. They only had Ray-Bans. But I hope you enjoyed this little field trip. We're going to head back to the boarding place and continue our lesson now. So the great thing about Colorado is to maintain social distancing. We have all these parks to get out and do some exegetical rock work in. So during this time, when we're asked to reduce our social contact, go out, hike, bike, walk, even just go sit in a park. What better way to pass this time? Okay, we're back. I hope you enjoyed the field trip. A couple of things I want to bring out. First thing is, Interpreting and studying the Bible should be fun for every age. The second thing I want to bring out is that when the text talks about the rock at Horeb, it's construing a very large geographical, a very prominent feature. God is standing on it, which conveys the idea of magnitude and solidity. All the people are going to drink from the water that flows from it, which means it has to be large and mass enough for the water to flow. We're not talking about something that you decorate your garden with. And as you read the text, I really want you to engage your imagination. What do you think it looks like? What do you think people were feeling as they complained about dying for a lack of water? What does all this point out about God's provision for water from the least likely source? A rock. Not an oasis, not a spring, not dry ground. It flowed out of solid rock. And he called the name of the place Massa and Meribah because of the quarreling of the people of Israel and because they tested the Lord by saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" In verse 7, this story closes with a memorial naming of this location. The fact that this location is given a specific name indicates its significance to the lessons that Israel learned at that location. It serves as a memorial to remind Israel to trust the Lord. The names given to these locations are taken from the verbs that Moses used to correct the people in verse 17:3. Massa is related to the verb for testing or proving, and Meribah is related to quarreling or striving. Unless we miss these connections, the middle part of the verse spells out the connection between these verbs and the names that are given to that location. Their failure was how they reacted to the situation, where they questioned the claim that God was among them. Now, because of the importance of this passage, it stimulated a lot of thought through the history of how this passage has been interpreted. The first thing I want to do is look at how the rabbis interpreted it. They offered a very interesting reading on it. As Israel wandered around the wilderness, that this rock would follow them and provide water during their 40-year journey, because after this you really don't have a lot of references to water or wells or springs or oases. So where did Israel get their water from? Well, the obvious answer is this rock kind of like furrowed its way along following them. So in the Talmud it says, so the well which was with Israel in the wilderness was like a rock about the size of a kabara, and was oozing out and rising up from the mouth of this flask, traveling with them up the mountains and going down the valleys. Wherever Israel encamped, it encamped opposite them before the door of the tabernacle. If we move on a little bit later, we come to Philo of Alexandria. And Philo interpreted this story allegorically. According to him, the rock Moses struck supplied something much more important than physical water to relieve their thirst or to provide life. Rather, this rock was the wisdom of God. He writes, "For the flinty rock is the wisdom of God, which is marked off from the highest and chiefest from his powers, and from which he satisfies the thirsty souls that love God." Now, Philo writes during the time of the New Testament authors, so his writings, are kind of important. Oftentimes in the New Testament, you can see where the authors are interacting with Philo's writings, where there's some crossover between them. Now, the passage from the Talmud and Philo's writings seem to also get picked up in Paul's thought. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 4, Paul writes, "For they were drinking from a spiritual rock, which followed them, and the rock was Christ." Now, he's talking about Israel during the wilderness. And he really interprets that rock there, not like Philo does, as wisdom, but he sees that rock that's following them as actually Christ, the source of salvation. And finally, I want to back up a little bit here. The mentioning of the names of these locations and how it entered into the national memory of Israel is very important. The psalmist writes the following, "For he is our God, and we are his people of his pasture, and the sheep of his hand. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as at Meribah, as on the day of Massa in the wilderness." Psalm 95, verses 7 through 8. The story of Rephidim and the rock at Horeb. The story of Rephidim and the rock at Horeb asks some really important questions. Where do we place our trust? Is it in the physical things that we can see and touch? Is it in our 401k plans? Is it in our government or in our families? Where do we place our trust? Or another way to ask this is, how seriously do we adhere to what we believe? We say that we believe that Jesus died and rose again from the grave, just as Israel would have confessed that God was the God who delivered them and was leading them through the wilderness. But do we put our beliefs into practice better than the people did at Rephidim and Horeb? Christ delivered us from the power of death, and perhaps more importantly in light of this passage, he delivered us from the fear of death. So I said at the very beginning that if you stuck around, I'd give you a little up. For a while now, I've been challenged with the idea of starting a YouTube channel. This started off as a way to get better video and better quality videos to my students that I teach with Fuller Theological Seminary. But then I realized that it could have a much wider audience. And so I began to think about this and figure out how I could do it. Well, to cut a long story short, about 2 weeks ago I sold off some computer equipment, my old cameras, and I even sold off a bicycle, if you can believe that. Unfortunately, just as I sold everything, that's when the coronavirus hit. But in the meantime, I've ordered quite a bit of camera equipment, and it's coming as I get that equipment put together and the system put together. I'm going to be rearranging my room here, hopefully upgrading what I have and what I can offer to you guys in a very serious way. Now here's what you can do. Below and to the right of this video, there should be a subscribe button. If you click that, then you'll be subscribed to my channel where I post my videos. That makes it very easy for you to find the videos. The second thing is there's a little bell there. After you subscribe, click on the bell, and then every time I upload material, you'll get a notification that I've done so. Now don't worry, this isn't going to go crazy. I hope to have one video per week uploaded to this channel. So, I hope you have a great week, and I look forward to keeping in touch with you, hopefully in a much more professional manner than it is right now. Thanks. Have a great week, everyone. And speaking of new stuff, look what just showed up. Okay, so the camera showed up the other day, but no lens. This showed up at the neighbor's house. And now, I will see you next week.